Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Big Topics, Short Takes, presented by the Columbia College Alumni Association. My name is Joanne Kwong, Columbia College class of 1997. I'm a board member of the CCAA and co-chair of its Intellectual Programming Committee. I want to give a shout out to my co-chair, Kurt Roloff's class of 88, who is based in the UK and couldn't be with us today as he had a conflict, but who conceived of this program with Professor Larry Jackson, director of the Center for Core Curriculum. Professor Jackson has been so supportive with regards to Big Topics, Short Takes, and intellectual programming for our alumni community in general. I also want to acknowledge our Director of Alumni Relations, Thandi Jarrett Abdullali. Hello, Thandi, who is just the best and working hard on a Sunday. Thank you so much. We also have John Vincenti and Kira Berry, who will be our discussion leaders later on in the program. So thank you to all of you. And especially to our Intellectual Programming Committee, who meet regularly throughout the year to create these intellectually curious experiences, even if we're far away from those days in Butler or hanging out on the steps. By the way, if you're interested at all in joining this committee or getting more involved or staying involved with Columbia or have an idea for a future speaker or event, you can always shoot an email to ccalumni@columbia.edu. Big Topics, Short Takes is a brand new series that we've been excited to present this year. It's a virtual series of short lectures, usually no more than 30 minutes, where we tackle one big, timely topic per semester or academic year and ask several of our esteemed professors to speak on those topics based on their expertise. This year's topic is on civil disobedience. We're experimenting with a few formats, but today we're excited to be using our core style format, where we'll be hearing from our speaker for about 20 to 30 minutes, doing a brief Q&A for about 10 minutes, and then breaking out into discussion groups, kind of like back in the core, led by fellow alumni for about 30 minutes. After that, we'll reconvene briefly for some closing thoughts. At any time during the program, feel free to enter a question into the chat box on your screen. This will only be seen by the hosts and the co-hosts, the discussion leaders, who will be collating and combining questions as best as we can due to time constraints. And one last introductory word about this semester's theme of on civil disobedience. There certainly has been no shortage of it on our campus this academic year. I feel lucky to live close to campus and to be able to visit regularly. Just last week, I participated in a pre-commencement ceremony, and the seniors, as always, were terrific, thoughtful, interesting, frighteningly intelligent, hopeful for the future. So just wanted to let you all know that they seem like they're doing good, which I know a lot of alumni are concerned about. Today's program is Hannah Arendt and the Origins of Totalitarianism, presented by Professor Robert Neer. A little introduction of Professor Neer. Robert Neer is a professor at the Holt International Business School in Cambridge, Mass., where he teaches global business and law, and has been a summer lecturer in the Department of History at Columbia since 2015. He taught contemporary civilization at Columbia from 2006 to 2014 and received the Tom's Core Faculty Fellow Award for Excellence in Teaching. He is the author of Napalm, an American biography, published by the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. He has founded, developed, and sold media businesses in London, Los Angeles, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Boston. He received his U.S. History PhD in 2011, his Master of Philosophy in 2007, and his JD and MA degrees in 1991, all from Columbia. He studied Southeast Asian politics at the National University of Singapore as a Fulbright Scholar in 1987 and graduated from Harvard College in 1986. Professor Neer, thank you so much for joining us today on a Sunday. We are so happy to have you with us. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Neer.
Thank you so much. It's great to see all of you. It's just a delight to have a chance to talk about these ideas on a Sunday morning. So thank you so much. Joanne, why don't I share my screen here, this little presentation lecture that I prepared. I hope that this will be helpful for you. Exactly as you mentioned, I wanted to just introduce myself and discuss some kind of key points from Hannah Arendt the conceit of the core, which I have always loved, is that it's the opposite of the regular university structure, in which you kind of get an expert in a subject who then pours their knowledge into eager student minds, if it may be on the subject of physics or chemistry. But the core, in contrast, has its instructors attempt to confront 2,500 years of history. And as the chair of the Contemporary Civilization program, Professor Kitcher told me, nobody can really be an expert in all of this. So I adopted the assignment that my wonderful colleagues in the alumni organization gave me in this full spirit of this, which is to say that I stayed up until 4:30 in the morning last night, rereading The Origins of Totalitarianism, trying to do my best, just like I remember doing so many times, fearing the scorching intelligence of the students that I was going to talk to the next day, and really not wanting to get called out by them, which was kind of the status for teaching contemporary civilization for me for many years. And so it's in that spirit that I will tell you that these are kind of my thoughts, my description to you of Hannah Arendt. And I present myself to you simply as a kind of, I don't know, well, you've heard my background, interested person, and we can talk about this in the spirit of having fun and learning together, which is really the delight of Columbia community. So I usually always started my core classes with a question that I thought was relevant to the discussion. We're not going to have time for all 100 whatever people here to answer this, but it's great, to go around twice a week and ask the people all these kind of different interesting questions. So for Hannah Arendt, I really think, who are your people is a good question that you might consider. I will say, for me, you are my people. But that's kind of one of the ideas that she has. The program that we have here, as you heard, I've got about 20 more minutes to give you a kind of introduction to the origins of totalitarianism. Then we'll have a breakout, because that lets you talk and kind of like share your thoughts and listen to what other interesting people have to say about this text. If you haven't done the reading, I always tell my students, you never, ever, ever tell the professor you haven't done the reading. The proper phraseology is, I wasn't able to do the reading as carefully as I would have liked. And so if that's the situation that you're in, that you haven't done the reading as carefully as you would like, maybe you get a little less out of the discussion that we're going to have than if you had been able to read it more carefully, but you can still get a lot out of this background that I'll give you, thinking about these issues in a contemporary context, and some of the quotations and observations that Professor Arendt had. Then we'll be back here for maybe a 15-minute group discussion. As you heard, I think it's important for you to understand sort of where I'm coming from. So this is a picture of Hult's campus in Cambridge. I teach global business and law there. Some of the classes that I've taught are global business law, business and the world economy, global culture and business. See, get the little global culture. See there, like the little fun. Future societies, politics, philosophy and economics, and business of art. It was a fun project at Columbia, which I love. Both of my kids were born when I was finishing my PhD at Columbia. Fantastic campus. I taught contemporary civilization 2006 to 2008, and then as a full-time instructor of that class, which I really still just love, from 2011 to 2014. And then ever since, I've taught at Columbia in the summers a class, Empire of Liberty, A Global History of the U.S. Military, which is going to actually run from May until July. And I always tell all of my students that if you ever want to come and audit any of my classes, you're welcome. So anybody here wants to come sit in on one of those classes next month, you can. We have 18 students registered so far. As you heard, I went to Harvard College. I'm from Cambridge, Mass. Red Sox fan, sorry. And I got my BA in US history. I spent a year as a Fulbright scholar, this program that's just had so much like chaos imposed upon it, at the National University of Singapore, studying Southeast Asian politics. I went to law school at Columbia, and after a 14-year leave of absence, during which I started, developed, and sold a bunch of businesses, mostly in the Far East, I came back to the university and got my PhD in US history. So I kind of have a law business background. As you heard, I wrote this book about napalm, and kind of told the story of this horrific munition, and US military power is my kind of academic specialty. In London, West End and Broadway stage productions was the business that I helped start for a Hong Kong venture capital company there. I started my own business in Los Angeles, distributing TV programs to Asia. Moved it to Singapore when a company affiliated with the Singapore government invested in it and did a regional TV distribution business there. And then for about 8 years, ran a Asian media consulting company in Hong Kong. Eventually, I came back to Cambridge and started a streaming video company before YouTube, which I ultimately donated to the Library of Congress. In terms of discussion for our time here, I know that you all treasure intellectual debate, and I think that's really good. It's good to have disagreements. And I always tell my students this, every point of view is welcome in my classroom. But just remember, it's an academic discussion. It's not personal. So we're talking about these ideas sort of to learn together. Origins of Totalitarianism. This is a house that Hannah Arendt was born in. Her dad was an engineer. Her mom was a musician. They were both educated people. That was in 1906, so she was a person of the 20th century. When she was 7 years old, they moved to the town of Königsberg, which is in Prussia, part of Germany. Her dad had syphilis, so he was admitted to a sanitarium, and he eventually died when she was 7. So she was brought up initially by her mom. They were Jewish people, secular. At that time, anti-Semitism was very much present in that part of Germany, but Jewish people had been allowed to be citizens. I don't know, you might think of it, sometimes I think of it a little bit like Native American people who lived in the United States for many, many, thousands of years and then centuries in the United States, but were not citizens and then were granted citizenship, but still had a somewhat, to this day, have a kind of like uncertain relationship in certain respects with the state. When she was 14, she was like studying French, Greek, poetry. She read Kant. Kant also, that's the same town that Kant was from. And that's a picture of her at that time. So a voracious learner. Maybe some of you have met wonderful young people like that. And when she was 16, she said she had been insulted by a teacher at the school. This is the house that she lived in, or a picture of Königsberg at that time. And so she boycotted the classes because she thought that the teacher wasn't teaching her properly and was expelled from that school. So a lively and determined person, even at a young age. At 18, she went to university in Marburg, started studying theology and philosophy. So religion is really important, I think, to understanding a lot of her ideas, and began a love affair with the famous philosopher Heidegger, who then he later joined the Nazi Party. So that's a very kind of like interesting element of her personal life. She got her PhD when she was 23 at the University in Heidelberg and wrote about love and St. Augustine, the iconic Christian philosopher featured in contemporary civilization. Her first marriage was in 1929. There's a picture of her husband, Gunther Stern. And then the rise of the Nazi Party really affected enormously her life. Hitler took power in 1933, same year that Roosevelt was elected in the United States. So that's just US historian, very helpful date to remember for me anyway. And she started doing research on anti-Semitism here at this library, state library. So that's when she was 27. She was denounced by one of the librarians for the kind of research that she was doing, which was not allowed under German law under the Nazis. Arrested, put in jail with her mom. I couldn't quite fit that into the little bar at the bottom there. So for 8 days, which was obviously scary and prompted her to leave Germany and move to Paris. In Paris, her relationship with her first husband kind of had really fizzled out. They were not even living together. And she married her second husband, who she stayed married to for the rest of her life. She worked to support herself for Zionist relief organizations. And there's a lot of things that she writes about in the book that we're going to talk about relating to like countries and people and stateless people. Which you might hear, sort of echoes of today in undocumented people, or where are people being repatriated to, or where are people from? And also, of course, Zionist questions in many other respects too. That was how she made her living. Because of that work, she was then interned in 1940. So that was when Germany was putting a lot of pressure on France, and then escaped from this camp. So this is a picture of the signpost at that original camp where she was interned. So again, she fled. She went to Portugal, and then from Portugal went to New York. This is a picture of Times Square at that time, 1941, and spent the rest of her life in the United States. She started initially working as a journalist. She also continued to work for Jewish relief organizations. Her husband was teaching at Bard College, so she kind of made her living through thinking and writing and also working on Zionist relief. And she's really very close to all of us in the sense of the university. She lived at Riverside Drive on 109th Street, which is like a building that maybe you've walked past, or I definitely have gone on runs past there with some of the people whose faces I can see in the group here. She became a US citizen in 1950. And published this book a year after. So this is a book written like from this sort of perspective of this incredible turbulence, and you might consider it kind of trying to make sense of what had just happened to her. She wrote lots of books after that. The Human Condition, that's one book that I taught to my wonderful students in CC one year because they kind of just were curious about her and wanted to learn about her. She got a lot of attention in 1961 for writing a chronicle of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem and eventual execution, where she coined her phrase, the banality of evil, that a lot of people found thought-provoking. In 1963, she wrote this book on revolution, and she taught at many different universities. She taught at our school, Columbia. She taught at Princeton, Chicago. This is at a time, remember 1960, when like women were not tremendously welcomed or accepted in academia. So she was really a groundbreaker in many respects like that. She never took a tenured position. She said she wanted to maybe like be more autonomous and not be as tied down. Yale, Stanford. Ultimately, at the end of her life, she was a university professor at the New School. And she died in 1975 at the age of 69 of a heart attack during a dinner party with her friends at her apartment in New York. This is her grave. So that was her story. And I thought it would be helpful with that as a little bit of background, just to talk about kind of some of the elements of this book, because when you're in a CC class, of course, everybody's really busy, and so they might not have time to do the reading as much as they want, although there are definitely some students, you might recall, who really read every single page. And those students, like, I think they get the most out of CC and the best like discussion of it, but you have to be kind of like inclusive and meet people where they are, as it were. So I always try to give people sort of just my take on these books and explain the readings to them. So this book has three big parts. The first part is what she calls anti-Semitism. Second part is about imperialism. And the third part, totalitarianism, I put it in there in yellow because I think that's the most kind of like relevant to our discussion. But I'll summarize all of them for you. The first part, she talks about how anti-Semitism, at least in her opinion, changed from being a religious prejudice to being actually a kind of racist idea that Jewish people were their own race and the cause of the sufferings of Germany under the Nazi theories. This allowed for, she says, an alliance between elites and the mob. And she, in this book, kind of defines the mob very particularly as like dangerously alienated people, very prone to violence, but different from like the masses or like all people, a specific group of particularly alienated people. She says they were stateless because they were vulnerable. And there you can see a kind of echo of a lot of work that she did later on like helping people to emigrate to the British Mandate of Palestine, or rescuing people and trying to provide a place for people to be that they could be safe. She says that imperialist tactics were applied domestically in the case of anti-Semitism. And that cuts to what she talks about in the second part, where her argument is that the ideas and systems of the imperial governments in Europe were subsequently applied domestically. So the German imperial presence in Africa and other countries, the British imperial presence in India and other places were then brought home to Europe. And remember, I think you can disagree with the things that she says. It's just interesting and thought-provoking as a way of looking at this past that she's discussing. So her conclusion about anti-Semitism is that it was a political ideology, a test case, and a precursor for totalitarianism. Let's find this one group and try it out and see how far we get, and then we can apply it more broadly. The second part of the book, there are three parts, remember, anti-Semitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism. So in the imperialism part, she talks about how this process of imperialism, like going and ruling other peoples in different parts of the world, which all of the major European powers and also, of course, the United States engaged in, corrupted institutions within the countries, undermined the concept of a nation state, she says, and taught the tactics of racism, administration by decree, and lawlessness, which she defined as a rule without rights. In other words, like the British in India or the Germans in Africa or other European powers were imposing rules on people or ways of governing their behavior without following a legal code or a system. She says that this kind of practice facilitated the same kind of alliance between elites and the mob that she described in the case of anti-Semitism, and ultimately were tactics tried out in foreign countries that were then applied domestically, initially against Jews, then against political opponents, and ultimately against whole societies. Remember, she's talking about totalitarianism. So her idea of totalitarianism, she says, is restricted to what happened to the German people in Germany under the Nazis and to the people in the Soviet Union under Stalin. So to describe in a little bit greater detail her discussion of totalitarianism, which I think is the most interesting part of this book, and also I would always definitely say is like the part that is most connected to the ideas of contemporary civilization, which allows people to talk about politics and about how people organize groups of political communities. Her argument there is that it's, number one, a classless society. So think about what that means. Classless society means we're all together, all equal, in a sense. It's a totalitarian movement, by which she means a kind of social movement broader than any like political group. To put it in our own contemporary terms, it wouldn't be like a Republican movement, a Democratic movement. It would be like a social movement, a totalitarian movement by people throughout the whole society. She then continues to talk about what happens when totalitarian systems took power in Germany and in Russia, and then concludes with her theory that this mixture of ideology and terror created a novel form of government not previously seen. It's pretty interesting to me that she doesn't talk a lot about technology. One might say, well, railroads and telegraph and all these like industrial systems helped create these, but she doesn't talk about that so much as she talks about like ideas and ideology and movements of people. So to explain in a little bit more detail, this idea of the classless society that she calls a new form of government that seeks total domination. She says that the claim for totalitarianism in this type of a society is to control people's thoughts, their identity, and ultimately even their perception of reality. So you have heard kind of maybe echoes of that in books like 1984, but I do want to stress what really kind of came through to me with that these are really dramatically different societies from, let's call them, authoritarian societies, where people might not have a lot of freedom of action in various ways, but their personal thoughts, their perception of reality are not claimed by the government. Specifically, as I said, she uses Nazi Germany as one example, and Stalinism in the USSR, which lasted from 1924 until 1953 when he died. So a lot longer in the USSR than in Germany. She says, as a mass movement, these systems mobilize lonely and atomized individuals. Their leaders demand faith above all else, not consent by the people. So she cites Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's lieutenants, who said, "My honor is my loyalty." And you can see from that how like reality and people's thoughts and everything else becomes subsumed into this sort of faith-based system for the leader. Here's one quote, and then I think maybe the discussion leaders will ask if you want to talk about these quotes more, or maybe you have your own quotes or other ideas. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. Sometimes you hear echoes of that, like maybe, for example, some of the discussions about vaccines or some of the talk these days about how to stay healthy, or even, I don't know, I just saw Robert F. Kennedy going swimming in a sewage-filled stream in Washington, D.C. Nothing perhaps distinguishes modern masses as radically from those of previous centuries as a loss of faith in a last judgment, she says. The worst have lost their fear and the best have lost their hope. So remember, she's super interested in religion. She wrote her PhD thesis on Augustine. And this is an idea that religion kind of provides some structure. And in the absence of this structure, these types of regimes can rise. Second part of the totalitarianism discussion is about ideology. She says that totalitarian regimes embrace an ideology that explains all of history, predicts the future, and seeks world domination. So in the case of the Nazis, their racist theories, were supposed to undergird the 1,000-year Reich that would last forever and ever. In the case of the communists and the Stalinists in Soviet Union, all of history, according to Marx, had been leading up to this moment, and a communist utopia was in the future. It's kind of interesting. I was reading that and thinking about, I wonder if like capitalism is a comparable ideology. Like, does that explain everything? Does it seek to seek world domination in that way? The claim inherent in totalitarian organization is that everything outside the movement is dying. So in other words, you are on the kind of like on the side of history, moving in history's direction, and on the winning team, let's just say. She talks about terror. So she says terror is ultimately in a totalitarian society directed at everybody because the purpose is to transform the whole society. So it's not like terror to kind of like accomplish a specific aim, let's say cutting taxes or directing state resources to a particular business. It's actually to kind of like transform the way that people interact with each other. Therefore, it's an end in itself, which helps explain some of the kind of like things that, at least for me, when I was reading histories of these times just seemed so appalling, like, people thrown in jail for no reason, or you can't talk your way out of it because there's no real basis for the punishments that are being imposed. The multiplication of offices destroys all sense of responsibility and competence. It's not merely a tremendously burdensome and unproductive increase of administration, but actually hinders productivity. This is her point that these systems that get imposed, like the way that the Nazis actually ran their government, or the USSR actually administered its state, are not really like kind of utilitarian in any way. They don't actually produce necessarily better outcomes for people, but they have a sense of chaos of their own. I think you can criticize this. You can say, hey, the Nazis did produce a lot of military hardware, let's just say, or they restored employment, or the USSR had accomplished many, many sort of industrialization and development objectives. But her point is that, at least as she sees it, the fundamental purpose of the government, the chaos of the government, is because it's supposed to highlight the power of the leader and develop this totalitarian system. She says that ideological reality replaces truth. So in the case of Germany, like their race theory would explain everything, as I had mentioned, and predict the future. And in the case of the USSR, class, these laws of class would explain everything, even perhaps to us or to a rational, quote unquote, common sense armed person, they would not seem to have any direct connection at all. The Nazis did not hesitate to use at the end of the war the concentrated force of their still intact organization to bring about as complete a destruction of Germany as possible in order to make true their prediction that the German people would be ruined in case of defeat. And she has lots of examples of that. She says at a different place that if they said the USSR, like Moscow is the only city that has a subway. I mean, obviously, like Paris and Germany would have, Berlin would have subways. So how do you make sense of that? Well, you could make sense of that, for example, by destroying all the other subways, and then Moscow really would have the only subway, or saying that Moscow only had like the true subway. Moscow, by the way, does have a very beautiful metro system. But, there are subway systems, I would say, in New York and Boston, as well as other places. The concentration camps and eventually the extermination camps that were characteristic of both the Nazis and the Stalinist system were laboratories of totalitarian rule, she says, ultimately kind of in a way like the perfection of this system in which people become totally like stripped of anything. They don't have clothes, they don't have like property, they can't control their time. They're just like completely sort of vehicles of the will of the leader. So there's kind of some of the things that I thought were most interesting in that book and helpful. And as I mentioned a couple times during what I was just talking about, there are some contemporary resonances, but there are lots of other ones too. And I think to me, a lot of the value of this type of class is for you to actually see where it is important for yourselves. So I want to make sure that we have enough time for that discussion process, but I do also like to have things be kind of optimistic if possible. And so I just wanted to point out some of the things that she says that can be done to kind of counteract based on her observations. And she lived through this, denounced by the librarian, for God's sakes, and sent off, with her mom to a prison camp for 8 days. So some of the things that she says that you can do. One is you can defend the public realm and political pluralism. So I chose this picture of my former student, Sean, who is now a New York City councilor. remember him very well in CC. You can fight mass loneliness and atomization. So this is a picture of a girls' soccer team because I have to take my daughter to a soccer game later today. You can think critically and judge. So I think it's really like a celebration, the commencement that Columbia will have and the process of learning. You can preserve historical truth and reality. So there's a picture of one of our buildings and the process of research and like what's a good history paper and what's a bad one. And I assure you that I have read my share of excellent history papers, but it also does happen that sometimes people write bad ones. And, you know, I mean, World War II definitely came after World War I, and I'm going to stand by that. And if somebody wants to say that World War I was first, you know, second, then I don't think that's going to be a good history paper. This is a picture of Pegasus and Bellerophon, sort of order over unrule outside of our law school, uphold legal equality and human rights, reject ideological absolutism, she would say. So when somebody tells you they know the answer for sure, maybe that's something to resist. Although, of course, we do have that liberal paradox, right? The idea that you know, everything has to be listened to is a kind of truth of itself that's not gonna like resist, you know, would resist contradiction. I think it's really interesting to think about whether these devices, which are definitely a characteristic of our time, arguably, you know, the greatest information invention since the printing press, perhaps you could say. Telegraph was pretty important too. But anyway, whether they produce unity or division, whether you know, Madison said that the United States should constantly get bigger because it would be more free if it was bigger. And then other people say that these devices really make the world smaller. So maybe we're living in a kind of smaller place now than we were, you know, 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. You can think about the pandemic because the pandemic like definitely made a lot of people feel super lonely. I remember one of the slogans for my daughter's school, I think was we're going to be alone together, which is this sort of weird way of thinking about things. And two books that I really like that you might consider. One is What Money Can't Buy by Michael Sandel. That kind of cuts to the idea of whether we're in a sort of similar ideological time with respect to business and capitalism in the market. Sandel says we've moved from having a market society to being a market society. You also might like Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. He wrote it a while ago, but he was talking about how many people in our society in the United States, you know, don't have very strong sense of community together. So now we get 30 minutes to have a chance to share your thoughts. I have always adopted the custom that when I make a mistake, I give a book to people who find the mistakes that I make. So if you saw any mistakes in my presentation, I will be very happy to send you a book. Or if you want to stop by the campus, I'll give it to you in person. I did that because I was so scared of teaching Columbia students because I was really afraid that all these smart students would constantly be finding mistakes that I had made. And even now, after like almost 20 years of teaching undergraduates, I still feel that a little bit. So I kind of like that. It keeps you on your toes.
I think we have 5 minutes for the Q&A, and
Yeah.
we wanted to thank all the folks who had pre-submitted questions. So I collated some of them. The number one question from many alumni is about the current administration. So, thank you to several alums whose question is basically, is Trump the latest manifestation of authoritarianism? Are the current administration's policies leading to totalitarianism in the US? What lessons can we glean from Arendt's writing in order to make sense of the American totalitarian drift in the 21st century, if that's an assumption. But more questions of that type. That was the number one type of question that came through.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Arendt loved universities. She spent her whole life in universities. She thought that they had an incredibly important social role to play because they welcomed new ideas and the principles of intellectual inquiry. So I think that she would say that, first of all, the contemporary United States is a long way from the societies that she's describing. Maybe, as I had mentioned before, you can describe it as a more authoritarian move toward authoritarianism, but the idea of totalitarianism, the way it was practiced in Nazi Germany or the USSR with, the murder of political opponents, the routine use of confinement of large numbers of people in concentration camps is not where we are right now. But of course, you can see indications. You can see the identification of undocumented people as a people without a state. and subjected to arrest. You can see a kind of lawlessness in a lack of attention to the rules of courts and of the kind of judicial system that we have of a separation of powers. And let's call it a testing. And so I think that the attack on Colombia, I mean, taking $400 million of contracts that have, without any evidence of a valid claim for some reason that these contractual agreements should be abrogated, is really problematic, and I think that Hannah Arendt would find it to be along the lines of the historical processes that she had described. So I think that there is a direct relevance there to some of the quotations that I described and to the passages that she had on the identification of Jewish people as a special group outside of the normal political environment, which I had mentioned analogizing to people who were at the most extreme case completely undocumented, but even like there are so many degrees of citizenship, green cards or right of permanent residence and that kind of a thing. So I think that's helpful to think about in those terms.
Thank you. Maybe one more. Joseph CC66 asks, so many young people I know, they don't want to read the news, saying there's nothing I can do about it anyway. You're probably in a unique position. You get to see the kids who are very involved and those who are not. What would Arendt make of that quote?
So first of all, Arendt had many love affairs, wrote a dissertation on love and St. Augustine, and I think, believed in the importance of people embracing life with all of the passion and joy that is characteristic of young people. So I would say that a young person who says they don't want to read the news, my first question would be like, what do you like doing? If they don't want to do anything, then I'd be like, look, there's so many interesting things you should do. I would also say that the number one way to teach people, at least in my experience at Columbia, is not to tell them things as an instructor, but to try to elicit a reaction from somebody else that's a student that they admire. Because if they come to the classroom and they're like, wow, that guy, he did all the reading and he really cares about it, that's so much more of an impact on them than anything I could say. Like I could tell them this changed my life. And, to be like, prosperous and successful, you should read the New York Times every day or whatever kind of thing you want to say, and it will have maybe like this much impact. But if somebody that's in the classroom that they think is beautiful and talented and admirable, if they say, well, first thing I do every day is I read the New York Times, that will like probably have much more of an impact on them. So I think that I would say, first of all, it's an understandable reaction, because it can be depressing and frightening to read a lot of things in the news now and in the past. And so Hannah Arendt would say, embrace the joy and the kind of like delights of the present, and arm yourself and make yourself strong because things can go bad. And so these are the ways I catalog them in the presentation. These are the things that you can do to arm yourself and make yourself strong. Like, embrace teams and find other people. And the news will help empower you. I mean, that is a way of understanding the reality, which is outside of the ideological constructions. And practiced in general, it can strengthen the society. Practiced even on an individual level, it can help you become a kind of more complete and empowered and happy person. I would say that that's how her reaction would be to that comment.
Wow. On that optimistic note, shall we break out into our separate discussion groups? Thandi will help to separate us. You'll just be automatically taken into some breakout rooms. One will be led by Professor Neer. I'm going to lead another one. John Vincenti and Kira Berry will lead discussions, and we're going to talk about perhaps one or more, depending on time, of the 3 quotes that Professor Neer gave us. And it's relatively unstructured, and we'll have maybe 5 minutes at 1:10 to come back as a group and have some final thoughts.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a chance to get whatever concerns were, at least at the moment, off your chest and enjoyed the company of your colleagues and fellow alumni. We had a great discussion in our room and talked about some of the quotes and contemporary politics and all the things that are fun to talk about on a Sunday morning.
Is there, of the four groups, I don't know if there were any representatives chosen. In my group, there was one. Richard Cohen, is there one thing from our discussion that maybe you wanted to share?
I don't know, the diversity of issues about what's happening now and how these trends, these tendencies relate to ideas of Hannah Arendt and I don't know, trends in America over over its history. How did we, you might say, how did we get here? I think that there was a great deal talked about that surrounds all of that in different ways.
Thank you. Bob, any response, or John or Kira, anything that came out of your group?
I would say that we got here through crisis. I mean, there are crises that come. We're arguably living through the beginnings or middle of one right now. And so really it's like that's why I just think it's great to see everybody here. You know, just imagine if we had a discussion about the origins of totalitarianism for a Columbia Alumni Association meeting at a time when the federal government has arbitrarily suspended $400 million in contracts, which is a lot of money, without kind of really a statement of like what they want to have done by the university or what specifics are at issue. And nobody wanted to talk about it. Everybody was like, oh, okay, you know, actually like I'm gonna, I don't know what, do the Wordle or something. So I think that's very positive. And how we got here, think about Civil War, World War II, revolution, there have been, or depression, my gosh, there have been lots of crises. So we should take comfort in each other, I would say, Richard.
Any last words from any of the other groups? Bob's group or Kira's or John's?
Well, I would just say really quickly that we did talk, we just ended as we were coming back to the main room and talking about both what the phone has done in terms of isolation, but also acknowledging the community of coming together and having this talk. So
what was your conclusion, Kira? Is the phone like, you know, on the road to totalitarianism, or is it like a good thing, or is it just an administrative device that's not so important?
You know what? Very little of our discussion was actually about that. That was just in the closing mark, and just seconding that, you know, the community and on that piece of it. And we really did speak. We spoke a little bit about civil disobedience and you know what's going on and what does that mean and you know, and I think you know, and also looking into today, and we also had a very interesting quote on regarding Hannah Arendt and her writing on education, you know, and you know, caring enough to own what's going on. I'm mispronouncing that, but you know, I think it, you know, we all do care about what's going on, and I think that's why we are here and engaging.
Mm-hmm. I want to also say I was really happy. I lost a book. So the person who wrote that comment, if they could please like submit it. The point was that I think I said that the persecution under the Nazis began with the Jews and then expanded to political opponents. But in fact, communist people were often detained, even in some cases before people under the race laws. So that's great. In the spirit of improving and the constant quest for truth and light, I'm very happy. I'll send a copy of Napalm off to whoever wants it.
Love that. John, anything before we close?
Yes, everybody agreed on everything in my group and there was no dissent. No, we had a very spirited discussion. We started talking about the loss of faith and its impact on totalitarianism. We had disagreements on just how different these times and the times of fascism really were from prior centuries. And we morphed into discussions about the disorientation and isolation that Arendt says feeds totalitarianism, and we had another spirited discussion about that. I think that people fall into different camps. Some feel that Hannah Arendt makes some very good points. Some think that her distinctions are not really different from other time periods. And then some feel that even if Arendt was right about the period of time she was writing about, it's not clear whether it applies to today's times or whether we have to wait and see. And we finished off with some discussion about who's really benefiting from what's happening today, and with varying opinions. One opinion was that many tech industrialists are benefiting from what's going on today. So it's not like there's no one benefiting from the current events and the current political situation. So we had a very good discussion, and
Thank
all is
you.
resolved. No books get sent out, Professor.
I think if we wait and see, it will become like she described totalitarianism. If we just wait and see.
Well, time always reveals everything, but we're also the ones passengers on the ship at the same time. So I will repeat my open invitation to anybody on this call that wants to stop by my class coming up in a couple weeks. I hope that we can have more of these discussions, because I think this is a really good use of this technology. I mean, it would be really hard to get everybody that's on this call together in one place in kind of real life, as it were.
Professor, very quickly, what the building, if I might ask, in room is your class going to be in?
I don't know. I don't think they told me yet. I have to check on the computer thing. It's sometimes in Fairweather. It's been in Hamilton sometimes. So if you send me an email, I'll send you that.
And go through, because also you need the QR code to get on campus these days, which is easy to get. You just have to at least have a 24-hour heads up. So there, Thandy put it in the chat, email at CC Alumni. That's really any question, anything, anytime alumni. And even if you want to stop by campus, you can do that and show your family around. It's not that you can't come on, it just takes a little bit of pre-planning at the moment.
Yeah.
As an unsolicited plug for Professor Neer's generous invitation, I definitely encourage you to go and audit his summer class. I've done it twice, and it's pretty amazing. There's no, it's no coincidence that he was nominated by his students as the best CC teacher.
I hope there'll be room for 70 in the class.
Oh.
Elliot, you should definitely go.
I will go, I can assure you. And I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank the Joanne, you and your colleagues for arranging this. And as one who was in the all-male class of 500, I'm delighted that women were accepted.
You're the best, Elliot.
Thank you. On that note,
a quick question: is this recording going to be available?
Yes, Thandi, we are.
Yes, I can jump in and say the answer is yes. We'll put our finishing touches on it and get it ready and packaged to send out. Just give us a couple days, and we'll get it out to you.
Yeah, related question. Will you edit in all of the breakout rooms? So those of us that weren't in the other breakout rooms will see the discussion, or would that not be advisable or possible?
That's a really great question. And I don't know if our Zoom permissions allowed the breakout sessions to be synchronously recording the various rooms, but I will investigate. I think it's a fabulous question.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
On that note, thank you so much to Professor Neer for your wisdom and sharing your scholarship on this Sunday. Silent claps. Oh, noisy claps, great. We really appreciate the free books and the open invitations to audit. And also we appreciate your optimism too. That's how we ended at our breakout group, that we, the eternal optimist, that, we will you've given us a list of things that we can think about doing, and we really appreciate that. I also want to thank Kira and John and Thandi for all of your hard work on this program. And if you wish to stay or get involved with the college community or have an idea for a future big topic short take, please reach out to us at ccalumni@columbia.edu. Hope to see many of you at Reunion, which is May 29th to May 31st, where there will be many more opportunities to talk about Hannah Arendt and totalitarianism. So on that, I think we'll close. Bob, any last words from you?
Sounds great. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you have an excellent, excellent Sunday. And Thandi, thank you so much with your kids. You spent the morning, so give them a hug.
I will. Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thanks, everyone.
day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you at the
Yeah,
next
bye-bye.
program.